Good morning and welcome everybody. We are glad you were able to join us today. We have a great session for you as we talk about class-wide math intervention for students in grade 1 through 3 with our presenter, Dr. Robin Cotting. Our session this morning runs from 8:30 a.m. to 11:45 a.m. We will have an opportunity for a formal 15-minute break throughout the morning. You'll also have the opportunity to discuss and meet with your district teams. We'll have some breakout rooms specific for your teams this morning. We will go over some information at the end with regard to helping implement these. What our hope is that you take these skills back and implement them in your schools. We will have a follow-up on March 30th. We'll learn more about that throughout this morning's session, but we really want to welcome everyone. Please know closed captioning is enabled. So if you would like to see captions, just hit the little CC on your screen and you'll be able to see the live captioning. So without any further delay, it is my pleasure and honor to be able to introduce our presenter this morning, Dr. Robin Cotting. We're happy to have her coming back to Pennsylvania, even through Zoom. We're glad to have her here this morning presenting about class-wide math intervention. A little bit about Dr. Cotting. She is a professor of school psychology at Northeastern University. She earned her doctorate in school psychology from Syracuse University. Dr. Cotting completed her internship and fellowship at the May Institute in Massachusetts, where she served as an educational and behavioral consultant. Dr. Cotting's research focuses on developing and exploring the effectiveness of school-based interventions, the factors that contribute to student responsiveness of those interventions, and strategies to support implementation. Dr. Cotting's work has emphasized academic interventions and assessment for database decision-making, most specifically in math. She was the co-recipient of the Leitner-Whitmer Award for this research in 2010. Dr. Cotting is editor of the APA Division 16 journal, School Psychology. She has over 85 publications and 120 peer-reviewed and invited presentations. She is the co-author of a book available from Guilford Press entitled Effective Math Interventions, a Guide to Improving Whole Number Knowledge. You are all in for a wonderful treat this morning. We love the work of Dr. Cotting. The book is a great book, one of our go-to resources. Just know, my name's Erica Kruder, by the way, and there are a couple patent consultants on. We'll be here helping and assisting Dr. Cotting throughout the morning, checking the chat, facilitating breakout rooms. If you need anything, let us from the patent team know. But otherwise, it is my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Cotting.
Thank you so much, and I'm so delighted to have the opportunity to be here with you today. And I want to talk about the structure of what we're going to do today. So we're going to start by talking about why class-wide interventions. So I think this is a wonderful opportunity that Patent is providing you with the idea that we can make adjustments to how we're delivering our supports to all of our students in our classrooms. And I'm going to talk about why that's so important. I'm going to talk about what class-wide interventions can consist of. And of course, we're going to be talking about utilizing a particular form of class-wide intervention in our conversations and in your work that you're going to do over the next 8 weeks. Then we're going to have a 15-minute break, as was already mentioned by Erica. Then you're going to have the opportunity to build your class-wide intervention and at least start looking at some of the materials that I provided to you as examples for how you might go through this process and what you might use and what might this entire class-wide intervention sequence might look like. So you'll have 2 different opportunities to go over the materials in 2 different ways as a way to begin that thought of how to plan this exciting opportunity to engage in this work. And then we're going to end by talking about using data to inform your class-wide intervention, which is going to be the basis of some of the conversation that we're going to have on March 30th. So with that, why class-wide interventions? So many of you have probably, obviously been in the field and seeing this firsthand. We knew before actually COVID-19, if you had looked at the data and we knew that school closures were impending, we did have enough data that was apparent in different places to know that we were probably going to come out of these school closures and alternative school openings with some pretty considerable losses. And that's because we knew that the remote learning environments that we had available in our schools were not necessarily going to be adequate ways for students to get learning information. And we had some history because when you look at some of the catastrophes that have happened previously, the natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina, we had seen that there was actually more learning losses in the area of math than in reading. That math in particular needs to be in the classroom, and it needs to be part of that direct instructional process, in part for many reasons, but in part because we don't sort of do math for leisure the way that we do reading for leisure. And so that is part of why we see some of these large gaps. So you've all seen the headlines, you've lived it. Reading and math scores fall sharply during the pandemic, data shows. And then of course we had the 2022 NAEP data come out. And I think that was maybe something that provided a source of, reality or reflected what people were seeing in the classrooms where they saw these large drops. We saw drops in reading and we saw drops in math. And these data are, I believe, the 4th grade data. There was also pretty substantial losses when we looked at it in 8th grade. And I think the 8th grade data is even more compelling in a way in math, because the 8th grade data really shows how what one of my colleagues has termed the phrase aggressively hierarchical math content is. In other words, if we don't really have students mastering those foundational skills, it's going to be really challenging for them to access higher level content. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind when we talk about the why of class-wide intervention and what we're going to do in that class-wide intervention space. So we knew from the COVID-19 response and looking at the 2020-2021 school year that K-8 students started the year behind. And I think that was something that everybody had anticipated. I think what we didn't necessarily anticipate is what you're seeing here with this arrow, which is that students also made fewer gains throughout the year. So that initial skill level actually was important for us to think about that level of performance, but students also did not grow as much throughout the year. We saw median achievement drop 8 to 12 percentile points compared to the spring of 2019, and average losses over the 2020-2021 school year was about on average 5 months of learning. And of course, we know that many students, especially students that came from economically and educationally disadvantaged backgrounds, were already at an elevated risk for mathematics difficulties earlier in their education. And we have to address those needs through schooling, unless otherwise they're going to persist, as I mentioned, which we're seeing play out in that grade 8 data. And of course, that was all exacerbated by COVID-19. And we saw these disproportionate losses. So what is reported on this screen is the average losses, but there's disproportionate losses that were affiliated with in-person learning, access to high-speed broadband internet, access to tablet and computer devices, as well as the longstanding inequities that were related to school resources, as well as there's some data showing how senior school district returned to school with poor outcomes for schools that were actually closed for longer periods of time. We know that students of color ended this school year further behind than white students. Students in low income and urban areas lost more learning than those in high income, rural and suburban schools. So all of this is just to give us the background for, this is the perfect opportunity for us to re-look at what we already knew wasn't working, because now we have the outcome and the exacerbation of, something that none of us could control, global pandemic that exacerbated or illustrated all of those challenges. And the good news in all of this, of course, is that we do have options for how to move forward and address those needs. And that really comes down to thinking about and leaning on this MTSS model that we have. So one of the reasons that we talk about MTSS as an alternative way to engage in our service delivery for students in schools is because it can support all the learners in our buildings. However, it's important to remember that that system is a layered system of support, and that's predicated on that high quality tier 1 support and access to that support. So I have 2 different graphics that you see on this slide because I couldn't decide which one I liked more, but both of them show this layering idea. So whether it's the upright triangles that you're seeing on the left-hand side of your screen, or it's the leaning or flat-ish on the right-hand side of your screen, you can see that there is a layering process. What we know about that layering process is that all students benefit, of course, from high-quality Tier 1 instruction, but those students in Tier 2 and Tier 3 actually will have better outcomes if their high-quality Tier 2 or Tier 3 intervention supports are provided on top of a high-quality Tier 1 support. Burnett and colleagues in 2004 suggested that the entire technical adequacy of this model relies on being able to make those good decisions within and between tiers and across those tiers. So really the point of this slide is to illustrate and remind us that this is a layering process, and what happens in Tier 1 is important for every single student that we see in our buildings. This is another example. You can see in this pyramid, the whole pyramid is supported by this high quality core instruction that's provided in the general education classroom. And we do have some data to show that it is important to spend our time in this space and to make adjustments the way in which we're talking about today in order to strengthen and support that infrastructure at core. So what we know from the data is that if we strengthen those core instructional practices, we are going to reduce the number of students who will require additional supports to be successful. So for example, Amanda Vanderhooven has some really compelling data that illustrates that if you even provide up to 6 weeks of a class-wide intervention, much like we are going to be talking about today, you can better identify those students who actually need targeted or individualized intervention supports. So in other words, we're able to help catch all students up, and then from there, we are able to identify those students who will need something more. It therefore frees resources to provide those students with or at risk for learning disabilities the services and supports they need, because we've already done another layer of class-wide intervention support and bolstered all students' skills. And then from there, again, we can see those students that need those needs. And then that reduces the number of students in those top 2 tiers, which we are more able and have the resources to address their needs. Because we've identified truly who those students are. We can increase the accuracy with which we identify students that need specialized intervention supports, as I had already mentioned. And what are the results of this? By strengthening core instructional practices, we actually get better outcomes for students receiving those specialized intervention supports. And that data comes from work from Lynn Fuchs and her colleagues, who do a lot of work in this space on interventions in particular. And they've investigated what happens when we add a high quality Tier 1 intervention and a high quality Tier 2 intervention to students that need those Tier 2 supports. And the answer is the outcomes are better than if a student received sort of mediocre or poor quality Tier 1 and high quality Tier 2. So just because you have the high quality intervention does not mean that you're going to produce the better outcome for the student. You need to have that combination of high quality Tier 1 and high quality Tier 2. So this is an example of what we hope to see in your universal screening data, right? This is probably a pyramid that you may have seen multiple times, but this pyramid is showing you that at the bottom, we see Tier 1 core instruction. We want to see that 80% of students are responding to your core instruction and curriculum. And then you're going to have roughly 20% of students that are going to need something more than that core instruction. So they need those targeted interventions, or a smaller percentage will need those intensive individualized interventions. So this is what we hope for. This is what it looks like typically in a classroom. So this comes from the IRIS Center, and it's illustrating to you that in an average class of 25 students, there are about 6 students that will struggle with math. And 5 of those students in the average classroom will need targeted supports. And of those, 2 additional will need individualized supports. So this is just an example of what you might see in your everyday classroom. Another way to think about if this, how is this 80%, is that going to be a reality in my classroom, is to think about what do we know about math learning difficulties. So we know that 17% of school-age children will experience persistent math difficulties over time. 5 to 10% of students will experience persistent low achievement. and 4 to 7% of school-age children will experience a specific math disability. So that's where you get the 17%, is that you have up to 10% of students that experience persistent low achievement and 4 to 7% of students that have a specific math disability or dyscalculia. So many of you know that you may not be facing a situation in your own classrooms with that 80-20 divide between students who are responding to intervention, responding to core instruction, and students that need targeted or individualized supports. Rather, you might see some of these alternative illustrations of your pyramid. So what you see here is 3 pyramids that are fairly similar. So let's first begin talking about the one on the left-hand side. On the left-hand side, you can see that it's roughly 50-50, right? We have 50% of students that are responding to your universal practices and 50% that need supports. Already, that's going to put a lot of stress on the school system to provide the supports needed for 50% of your student population in the area of math. So we know when we see that kind of divide in our universal screening data that we really need to spend our time on universal core practices, figuring out how do we fill in those skill gaps or foundational skill needs that students have at that class-wide level, and how can we do that in the classroom routine efficiently and effectively. In the middle pyramid or triangle, you see what we often refer to as an upside down triangle. Sometimes we flip it literally upside down to illustrate it, but you can see in this example, it's more like 80% of students are needing targeted or individualized supports, and only 20% of students are sort of doing okay. And then you can have the same idea on the right-hand side with that 20-80 split in the opposite way. But in this case, most of the students in the illustration need those intensive individualized supports. So again, any version of this suggests to you, if you're looking at your universal screening data, that you really need to bolster tier 1. And there is some data that's been illustrated that the first triangle on the left-hand side is really the one that's more typical, particularly now. So we have maybe a 50-50 kind of situation happening, suggesting that where we need to put our energy and effort first before we can adequately support our tier 2 and tier 3 students or students in need of those services is to make sure that we are targeting that tier 1. So how are we going to do that? We need to do that in a systematic and structured way. So this is an example. Kowaleski and Vanderhagen have a new book on MTSS in math, and they call this a tier 1.5. So you can see instead of 3 tiers, I have 4 tiers, and you can see that dark green box is illustrating class-wide supplemental supports. So you have your tier 1, which is core instruction, universal instruction and curriculum provided to all students. We're going to monitor students 2 to 3 times per year. Then you have a class-wide supplement that you're going to target, where you're addressing foundational skill gaps for the entire class. And again, we're thinking about what are the average number of students needing in terms of skill gaps. What is the average skill gap look like? So you're targeting the middle or the most students with your foundational skill gaps that you're filling. And you're going to monitor that progress weekly. And you're going to do that for a short period of time, as I indicated earlier. So the hope is that at the end of that, we're going to be able to better identify those students who actually really truly need that secondary and tertiary support system. So you might be saying, okay, Robin, so you've convinced me that there's some importance for our tier 1 instructional supports that we're doing, that we need to bolster student skills, but what exactly are we going to do during that time? And what does the data actually say when we look at what do we do in core instructional practices that is really, really effective? So there's some really good data that I love to have the opportunity to share in this kind of conversation. And these are from meta-analyses. So a meta-analysis is a great opportunity to look at the summary of a whole bunch of data, and it's a review essentially of the data, and it's done in a quantitative way so they can put some numbers on it, and those numbers are effect sizes. So what you see on the graph here is on the y-axis is an effect size, and on the bottom, of course, is a description of the instructional practices that were examined in these meta-analyses. So these 2 meta-analyses were conducted at 2 different time periods. One was Pellegrini and colleagues from 2001 and Slavin and colleagues in 2009. These both come from the database instruction center at the University of Maryland. I don't have the name exactly right of that center, but this is a common kind of work that this group does, is summarize the practices, instructional practices in reading, math, technology, etc. So what we see here, we have primary grades in the dark bar on the graph, and the secondary is the striped bar. Curricula, if you look at curricula and whether or not curricula leads to improvement in achievement, we can see that we have what we would consider a very small, or at the secondary level, negligible effect, meaning that the curricula itself is not going to be the driver of math achievement. And so that's what we're getting out of these data. This middle one is computer-assisted instruction, and this was the traditional computer-assisted instruction. There still hasn't been enough tablet-based studies or studies with Chromebook materials for us to have a more modern idea of what computer-assisted instruction looks like. Most of this is coming from the computer-assisted instruction that is more traditionally done, maybe on websites or computer programs. And so what we saw here is that there was negligible effects of computer-assisted instruction in predicting or producing good math achievement outcomes. And then where we get the biggest bang for the buck, and of course it's still a small effect, but in instructional practice, a small effect is still a powerful effect. We see instructional process. So instructional process, I'll unpack what that looks like, what that means in a moment, but this is where we're getting more of our impact, is what we're actually doing with our instructional practices in the classroom. So our instructional process that was defined in these studies and by this group of researchers when they're looking at the literature is peer-mediated learning, classroom management, motivation, and metacognitive instruction. So you will see in our conversation today, which will include how do we engage in class-wide intervention with peer-mediated learning. We are going to embed classroom management, motivation, and metacognitive instruction as part of our practices. I think last time when I was talking to grades 4 through 6, they also had asked me, well, what about Hattie? And so Hattie's mechanism and process was a little bit different. And the reason they asked that is because their hinge point was 0.40. So on average, in instructional practice, when they looked at their data in the way that they defined their meta-analysis, they found the average effect size was 0.40 of most things that we do in the school setting, because that was a broader analysis. And so things above that were considered to be effective, things below that, so this is the visible learning that I'm referring to, things below that were ineffective. And so this is that was a different construction and way in which that group looked at the data than this. And this is the traditional way we think of effect sizes, is 0.20 is small, 0.5 is medium, and 0.80 is large. Okay. So with that background, we also have to talk about logistically, how are we going to make this work in our routines? Because one of the things that we know is that if the class-wide intervention process that we are going to engage in does not naturally embed into our classroom routine, it's going to be really hard to continue to implement and sustain. So we want to be able to do that, and we need to think about what does our core instruction classroom look like. So it has been historically very common to have literacy blocks that can be anywhere from 90 to 180 minutes. And so it's great to have the opportunity to think about, well, what is our math block? And we don't necessarily, there's no data suggesting that we need 90 minutes for our math block. So many of the recommendations are that a 60-minute block would be great, where you have 45 minutes of core instruction and a warm-up of 15 minutes. And so that's the way that I'm talking about this today. And of course, you can think about, well, how does that work in my system? And what do we do currently? And how would this fit in? So that's an important conversation to have during our breakout meetings. So we're going to target this 15 minutes of warm-up time as being the place where you're going to engage in that class-wide intervention. Oops, went too far. So the next part of that conversation is making sure that we are going to make the most out of that 15 minutes, because of course it's not a ton of time. And initially it will take more than 15 minutes. So it's probably better to allocate more time initially And as the process gets more efficient for you and the students, then you can get to that 15-minute block. But you may need to start out at a 20 or 30-minute block in order to be successful in helping the students acclimate to this new routine. But the goal is definitely to get it to that 15-minute mark. So just being mindful of how am I going to get to that 15 minutes? What do I need to do? How can I help the students along so that we can get there? So in order to make the most of that instructional time, which is brief, and we're trying to address foundational skill gaps, we first need to talk about what foundational skills are essential for our students in our grade. And we can think about that by talking about what are the grade level benchmarks that we think are critical, and what are the common errors that are happening in our particular class. It's also really good to think about what's happening in the grade level above us, and what do those teachers tell me that they need our students to be able to do when they get to that next grade level. One of the really interesting things about the National Math Panel Report, which was published in 2008, was that middle school teachers were very clear that they really wanted students to come and into middle school with fluency with their multiplication facts, and that was a big lacking component that they had observed as being a challenge in that middle school grade. And they also noted word problem solving as being a particular challenge. So thinking about talking to your teams and your teachers and knowing what is it that they really need our students to do, because again, we can't remediate the whole grade. We have to remediate the core foundational skills. So you're going to think about what are the foundational skills that are essential, what grade level benchmarks are critical, what are the common errors your class is making, and what are the teachers in the grade level above us saying that students really have to have when they walk in the door next year. The other way that we can look at what do we target is to look at the frequently cited math difficulties. So there was a study done by Bryant and colleagues in 2000 that I often talk about because it hasn't been redone. And it was really, really informative because it asked teachers, what are the common math difficulties that you observe in your classrooms? And I believe it was around 25 to 30 different math area difficulties that they identified. But across all of the teachers, there were 6 common areas. And that included solving word problems, multi-step procedural calculations, understanding mathematics language, checking work and answers, automatic recall of basic facts, and fractions. So fluency with fractions, being able to know that fractions, what the equivalency is between fractions and decimals and percentages. So that also gives us a really good bar on what to focus on. And then, of course, probably one of the most compelling arguments comes again from that National Mathematics Advisory Panel report, which is what are the critical foundations for algebra, which was the entire basis of that report, is what do we do in our K-8 instruction in order to provide those critical foundations. And it turns out that according to the existing data at the time, which was summarized in an interdisciplinary way, so across cognitive scientists, learning and behavior scientists, educational psychologists, and math educators, the consensus was that the prerequisites to algebra was whole number proficiency, fluency with fractions, and key aspects of geometry. So that really referred to finding the perimeter, area, or volume of shapes and using different formulas for that. So I think this helps to sort of anchor what are those key critical benchmarks that I'm trying to hit, and what are those foundational skills that might be related to those areas that we want to be able to target. And in our conversations, because I'm going to make another compelling argument, hopefully to you, about the need to have students be really good with whole number proficiency, especially in grades 1 to 3. But even generally well, I'll tell you in a minute, I'm getting ahead of myself. So we're going to target whole number proficiency as being one of those core anchors with our class-wide intervention practices that we are going to be utilizing. Okay, so here's why. So I won't get too far ahead of my slides here. What is the relationship between whole and rational number knowledge? So as a researcher and a university trainer, I get really excited about these data because I think it's so cool that we have had a lot of emphasis on looking at this data. So there was a group that had a Center for Fraction Learning at the University of Delaware, a group of researchers, And they spent a lot of time actually looking at this data, and very, very recently. So if you look at the citations I provided at the bottom of the slide, you will see that these data are from 2017, 18, 19, 16. So this is very recent data, and it really illustrated for us what this relationship between whole and rational number knowledge is, which again can help anchor what those core foundational skills are that we need to target in a class-wide intervention space. So what was illustrated is that students with inadequate whole number knowledge were more likely to have trouble understanding fractions than students with adequate whole number knowledge. I went ahead of myself. In addition, some of the quotes from the studies were really interesting from the authors, because they suggested that their findings highlight the value of developing long division and multiplication skills for fraction learning, and suggested that it would be advantageous to continue to practice with whole number, simple and complex calculation all the way through the intermediate grades, so all the way through the primary school and even into 6th grade. Because what they were intending to actually study in some of these studies was rational number knowledge in 6th grade. And they realized that the students were not anyway prepared or ready to engage in that learning because of the whole number knowledge gaps that the students were experiencing. So this is another way. Several studies have looked at, well, what exactly predicts fraction knowledge, for example? And they were able to demonstrate that whole number magnitude representations and calculation fluency are the predictors of fraction knowledge. And they demonstrated this in multiple ways and across several studies. And those studies demonstrated that it was calculation fluency with both basic facts as well as complex computation. So this is the rationale and reason for why we target that whole number proficiency. Okay, so I think I did get ahead of myself, and here's actually the quote that I was referring to earlier, where it says, our findings also highlight the value of developing complex multiplication skills for fraction learning. As such, it is advantageous for students to continue practicing these skills during the intermediate grades and even into middle school. So the way in which that I like to organize this is in terms of two different buckets. So when we look at our universal screening data, we want to see, okay, what are students missing? And again, if we think about this from a class-wide level, we want to be able to say, okay, universal screening, what do most of my students in the classroom know? And what do most of my students not know that I expected them to know? And where is that gap? And for all of you, it's going to be in that whole number knowledge space. So then you need to target, okay, is it numeracy or early numeracy is another way to talk about this. So things like counting and cardinality, magnitude, quantity discrimination, or is it in the number operations space, or is it in word problem solving? And given that we're talking about targeting grades 1 to 3, we're really talking about the numeracy number operations area. So I just wanted to give you this broader perspective, because then this is how, as students progress through schooling and even into 3rd grade, you might start to think about, okay, well, where are some of those gaps? Because they're going to diverge more as students increase in terms of their time in school. And then, of course, at the middle school level, we have to really think about, okay, where is the gap? Rational number or whole number knowledge? And there, again, you go back to whole number knowledge first and fill in those gaps, because as I mentioned before, I believe it was Corey Peltier that said, aggressively hierarchical is math. Math is aggressively hierarchical, and we always need to remember that. So we want to be able to build fluency with math facts and complex computation. This is a great place to begin, because it will help with whole number proficiency, which we now know is really, really critical for students later learning in math and access to higher level content. And we also can do it in that 15-minute window, which is our target for that class-wide intervention. So for example, we know there's 390 math facts, and then of course there's lots of different ways to look at our complex computation. You guys are going to be focusing on those basic facts, and then starting to get into that, some of those early complex computation elements. So we are going to spend a lot of time on increasing practice. So opportunities to practice are critically important, because they provide us with opportunities to really actively engage students in doing something. And we can do that through verbalizing, we can do that through writing, and you're going to do that in both ways in this class-wide intervention activity. So what you can see on your right-hand side is an Institute for Education Sciences practice guide, what to do with students that struggle with math in elementary, grades, and this just came out in March 2021, and there are 6 key practices that have strong evidence, and one of them is embedding timed practice activities in order to build fluency. So that's one of the basic practices that we need to make sure that we're using. We're going to use that in our opportunities to engage with our students in your Classwide intervention. Deliberate productive opportunities to practice, of course, are required for all types of learning. And I think it's always helpful to think about this because we think about practice in sports and music and math is also has to be part of that conversation. I know I have children who play soccer, and our youngest is 6. So he recently, we were saying, you know, our 12-year-olds we felt like did not get fundamentals in soccer, I will say, fundamental footwork. And we just signed him up for a program that was supposed to be fundamentals, and all they're doing is scrimmaging. And we, my husband and I were like, oh, this is not what we want. We want these fundamentals because we know what that difference is and how that affects students down the line, because we have a child that is 12 who is struggling in that area. So thinking about fundamentals, whether it's, and art should be included in this as well, is really important. Again, we want to promote that active engagement with math content. We want to provide high levels of feedback and support to students, because when they do that, then they can engage in their own learning because they understand what they know and what they need to know, and that they can get there, that we're supporting them. We can help them get there. And then, as I mentioned already, those timed practice opportunities that promote efficient and effective performance when we apply them in the correct way. All right. So that leads me to thinking about practice really specifically with you. I think it's good to rethink practice and think about practice in a more complex kind of or more broader perspective. So I'm going to ask you to consider 3 aspects of practice. There was an earlier IES practice guide on RTI or MTSS in math that called for 10 minutes of daily math practice, incorporating deliberate drill and practice. We know results in better outcomes than when we spend it completely on conceptual ideas and we don't provide enough practice opportunities. So this is a really great idea to go back to. Okay, how do we build in those 10 minutes? Well, we're going to do it through a Classwide intervention. So our 3 areas of practice include guided practice, which is when we are establishing a skill. We want to improve accuracy, and we're going to improve accuracy by having more teacher-led modeling and demonstration. We want teachers to also think aloud while solving a problem, to model what it looks like to think aloud. What we know about talking about math is that if teachers model how to think aloud accurately, then students will know how to do that too, and they will talk about math in an effective way. We also want to include worked and partially worked examples. So we want to make sure that we're providing students with a fully worked problem and talk through that entire fully worked problem, then have students work through a partially worked problem, and then have them engage in that problem solving on their own. The second area of practice is what we might call timed practice, which we just talked about. Whoops, my slide is advancing on me without my assistance here. Timed practice, which is retaining and maintaining. So the first kind of practice, guided practice, is establishing. The second form of practice is timed practice, which the goal is to retain and maintain skills where students already are accurate. So we want students to be 90% accurate before they engage in this student-led activities, or which can be partner activities or independent activities. And the idea is to promote fluency. We can use flashcards and worksheets, team-based learning or peer-mediated learning, and technology. And the third one is cumulative review. And the goal here is to maintain, or not maintain skills. We are enduring and applying skills. We want to see those skills that we think students are maintaining persist over time and be applied into novel tasks. So we want, in this case, to create activities where students have to integrate previously learned skills with newer skills to promote generalization. And we can do that through games and challenge problems and something we call interleaved practice, which is when we put previously learned knowledge all together in practice activities. Okay. So we are at the point of having had a conversation about why we are doing this Classwide intervention work. and what the content area is going to be. And you've gotten a little bit of background about what the basis or the idea of the instructional principles are that we're going to be using. So the next part of what we need to have a conversation about is, what are those class-wide interventions? So the goal of the class-wide intervention is to build fluency with core foundational skills. That's our goal. And we're going to do that by increasing the number of opportunities for practice and the amount and type of feedback. We want to improve, you're looking to improve the average class performance, because again, there will be students that need targeted or individualized supports in your classroom. And so we want to see, did the average overall performance of your class improve? And if they did, that's our goal. And of course, we'll be able to better identify those students that need additional supports following this practice. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we really want to make sure that we can embed this class-wide intervention into the naturally occurring classroom routine. So there are a couple of ways to do this, and one of them is kind of, so I'm giving you some big broad ideas. So this is, if you weren't going through this plan that we're going to talk about together, how would you think about this in your own schools and in your own classes? So that's why I'm giving you this. This is kind of background information, but we're going to have a more targeted plan. If you were starting this from scratch in your schools, you would want to look at your classroom universal screening data and classrooms that are performing on average below the 25th percentile. That's when you would say, those might be the good classes that we should target for our intervention practices. We also talked about just looking overall at that pyramid for your grade level and saying, hey, what does that look like? Is it below that 80%? And if so, in terms of the 80% are responding to your intervention according to the universal, or your instruction according to that universal screener, then we can say we might need some class-wide intervention. Then you're going to provide that brief 10 to 15 minute intervention that we've been talking about. Our intervention itself is 10 minutes, but of course we have a lot of setup and takedown time. So that's why I targeted that 15 minutes. And then, of course, at the beginning, it will be a little bit longer. And that brief intervention is going to increase opportunities to practice skills and concepts and increase the amount and type of feedback provided. And those two areas were really particularly targeted in these class-wide intervention practices because of the data that we have on these skill areas and opportunities to practice and the amount and type of feedback that we're giving. So we're specifically going to talk about peer-assisted learning or peer-mediated learning. Those terms have been used interchangeably, so you can think of them interchangeably. What we know from the data, and there's a lot of data on this, and a lot of data on this in math, is that students working in pairs or small groups, for example, scored higher on the NAEP 2017 data than their peers who did not work regularly in pairs or small groups. We know that this particular peer-assisted learning benefits students from low-income minoritized backgrounds that participated in urban schools, as well as English learners. So oftentimes in our research, unfortunately, we don't have, we typically have research that focuses on middle-class suburban schools, but this is an area of research where we had a lot of diversity in the samples that were utilized with peer-assisted learning, and so we know it benefits all students. It is better when students monitor their own outcomes in peer-assisted learning, set goals, and evaluate their own performance. And I think one of the take-homes that, at least that I took away from the class-wide intervention that was done in the grades 4 to 6 was that this part was really integral to what they saw and the benefits that they saw. And then the last one is that there is more evidence supporting benefits for targeting whole number concepts and whole number proficiency in general than there is for rational numbers. So this is this work has really been done specifically and shown to benefit that whole number proficiency area. Oh, I forgot. When we talked about this third bullet, better when students monitor their own outcomes, set goals, and evaluate their own performance. The other corollary benefit that wasn't necessarily anticipated but has been described routinely and regularly in the multiple meta-analyses that exist on this topic is that students' social skills or ability to work together actually improves as well. So let's talk about the steps. So these are the steps that you're going to apply. The first one is to select an activity and set a time. So our target time is 15 minutes. We have a lot of activities, and that's part of what you're going to look at through the breakout rooms is the activities that I drafted for ideas for you. The intention is that the materials I'm providing can give you the basis or the background. You can adapt and change and modify and do what you need with those materials. We are going to do a lot with flashcards because of your students' grade levels and the skills that they're working on. So that's going to be one of the key features that you're going to utilize. We're going to pair students. We're going to provide background and review key concepts and procedures. Well, you'll provide background and review key concepts and procedures for students on the math topic itself, and also on how students can work together. You're going to identify rules specifically for working together so students know what they are and can follow those. You can create a team scorecard. This is an optional component that we'll talk about. You can have pairs select daily or weekly goals. That's another option. You can assign students, or you will assign students to begin as tutor or coach. I like to use coach and player. So you'll see that the materials that you have use the word coach and player. Everyone gets to be the coach. Everyone gets to be the player. You know, the other way to talk about it is traditionally we talk about it as tutor and tutee. And this is called a reciprocal peer tutoring model where everybody gets to do both roles. We're going to use the timer to signal role switching so that students get equal amount of time as the coach and the player. And then we're going to have a wrap up where students evaluate their teamwork and goals, or you work with the classroom to say, how do we do working together today? So the first one, selecting activities and setting the time. So we're going to set it a 15-minute time. We're going to use a lot of flashcards. There will be review activities. So this is an example of review activity for a multiplication task on the top where you see the 8. And then on the bottom, you see some fact family worksheets that we're going to utilize. So that is an example of some of the activities that we're going to utilize. In order to build computational fluency, we want to, again, have at least that 10-minute target that was talked about earlier from that prior Institute for Education Sciences guide. We want to make sure that we are targeting skills that students have 90% or more accuracy with if our focus is on building fluency. You'll see that I have some backup strategies or what we call thinking strategies. You can refer to them as something different in our materials, or the materials that I provided. I call them thinking strategies. We have backup strategies to help students when they don't have that 90% accuracy. And I think that's going to be fine for your students. Of course, in order to build computational fluency, we want to use these response cards, cooperative groups, technology. We're using a peer-mediated process. There's lots of different choices. The backup strategies that I was just referring to, this is when a student makes an error, how are they going to solve the problem? So when a student is inaccurate in being able to recall something automatically, then we want them to have a way to solve that problem. And so you're going to work with the students to help them help their peers in order to do that. So we'll use strategies like counting on or counting back, using 10 frames with tokens or dry beans, number lines. We have 10 frames that have more than one 10 frame, so you can make 10 first, and talking to students about how we can think about subtraction as really addition. So all of those strategies will be things that we're going to help students to navigate, and I've organized them for you in the materials in a particular sequence. And ultimately, we want students to be able to apply commutative and distributive properties. So knowing, for example, if 5 + 3 is 8, then 3 + 5 is 8, and how powerful is that to know that if I know half of my facts, I actually know all of my facts. The other part of what you heard in those 4 main bullets about the benefits of peer-assisted learning was this notion of self-regulation. So making students become aware of how they think when they're problem solving. And I have actually done peer mediation with kindergarten and first graders. And one of the questions the kindergartner teachers always were asking me is, how can our students really do this? And they can, because the materials and the structure of the process is being taught to them. So anyone can do this. And I get the same question when it comes to self-regulation. Yes, we can have students self-regulate their skills. It just looks different, right, for different ages. So the goal is to help students become aware of what they know and how they can improve their own learning. We want them to think about planning, monitoring, and modifying their work, and we can even do that in those grades 1 to 3. This is a self-monitoring checklist that is targeting a second grade problem. It's from the IRIS Center, and creating checklists is a great way to help with self-regulation. We can identify common errors, we can put them in a checklist, we can list each step and then compile it and have students check that off or use stampers to say, hey, I did this. So number 2, so that was number 1, the activities. Number 2 is pairing the students. So as I mentioned, it's a reciprocal peer pair process where each student will be the coach and the player. The most common way to do this, and this is something that you'll discuss in your teams, is to have the higher performing student pair with the lower performing students and have the middle range students pair with each other. Everybody does benefit, and that is one of the things that has been clear in the peer assisted learning literature. You can also choose whether to keep pairs together throughout this 8-week time frame or alternate pairs. And if you're going to alternate the pairs, how do you want to do it? Weekly, bi-weekly, monthly? What will be your decision? Number 3 is to provide that background and review key concepts and procedures. So this is talking about what are the math reasoning strategies for all 4 basic operations and what are the relationships between those operations. So in your materials, you'll see these thinking strategies for addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. You know, I generated these based on my own work and a projects that I had done previously, but you may have other strategies that you're using regularly in your classroom. So you may want to adapt these documents to include the strategies that you apply. Identifying rules for working together. So this is one of those important ones that can also be fun. So these are, I just gave some examples. Again, you can make this fit into what already exists in your classroom routine. So the ones that I identified was talking only to my partner, talk only about math, be helpful and be kind. So when you get into your groups, these are all the kinds of decisions that I'm hoping you'll be able to talk, at least have the beginning opportunity to talk through. You can create a team scorecard. So there's lots of ways to do this. You can just have a checklist of what the processes that teams are supposed to engage in. They can, as I mentioned before, stamp those. You can come by and circulate around the peer pairs and just put stamps on their pages, or sometimes we've done that in a 5-frame, so that students know that they can earn stamps for doing a good job working together and working with their partners the way that we taught them how to. Another way that you can help with the class management or peer management process is to use the good behavior game. We use a modification option of the good behavior game where the class competes against the teacher as opposed to each team competing against themselves or each other, excuse me. So we would do it where if they follow the rules that we just talked about, then they get points. And so you would just periodically put points on the board for the class for following those rules. And then if they don't, then the teacher gets a point. Typically at the end, then we are able to say, okay, who has more? And it's usually the students, and then the students will tell you how much more they have than the teacher. Number 6 is to have pairs or individuals select daily or weekly goals. I modified this from the 4-6 trial that we did previously. So you have goal reflection sheets that would match grades 1 to 3, and you can decide which choices you want to make for your students in this area. So there's a goal reflection sheet, there's a facts I know sheet. You can create specific learning goals for students, and then of course we're always looking for overall to improve that progress monitoring score on average for your class. Of course, part 7 is we're going to assign students to begin as coach and players. So you're going to randomly assign students each day to start as a coach. Or students can pick which one they're going to be out of a hat, or you can just switch every other day. So there's a lot of options in how you want to organize that. So that's one of the things that would be good to talk through with your teams. And then in terms of the timer, this is fairly simple, right? Where you're going to demonstrate and model the practice or skill or concept that's being covered for the day. You're going to then assign those roles for the first 5 minutes. You're going to use that timer, and then when the timer goes off, after 5 minutes, then students are going to know to switch those roles, and they'll do this same activity for 5 minutes, and then at the end you'll collect materials. And then the last part again is to wrap up, evaluates teamwork and goals. So reflect on how well students follow the rules and working together. If you did the good behavior game version that I was referring to, then you could talk about, hey, how do we do today? Administer rewards if you're using them. So sometimes I had mentioned each team, each pair would have that 5 frame, and you can go by and put stamps in that 5 frame. So if students earn, all of the stamps for their day, they can earn rewards, which could be anything that you typically already use in your system. You can review daily goals if you created daily goals, and weekly goals you would review on Friday after progress monitoring, if that's something that you decide to utilize in your system as well. So we want to talk a little bit about how do we adapt these activities. So these are things to keep in mind down the road probably, or unless you want to infuse them in how you're thinking about it right now. So if a student is close to mastery, then you want to increase the salience of their feedback. So you want to add goals and rewards. If a student is struggling to grasp content, then you want to scale back and work with prerequisite skills or build self-monitoring checklists to support students. If student engagement is the problem, you want to add options for choice or rewards, or vary how the information is presented. So we've had some studies where we actually varied every day, whether students were using worksheets, whiteboards, or flashcards. In the samples that I gave you, I believe I set it up without as much of that variability. So that's something to think about too. And there are other adaptations that you can make as well. So these might be things that you decide to change on March 30th when we have those conversations, or you may decide to use some of these adaptations after engaging in this process, this peer-assisted learning process, for a few weeks and deciding that something new needs to happen because of something that's come up in your room. So you can always make word problem extensions. So each pair can turn a calculation problem into a word problem. They can exchange and solve them. The checklist we've talked about, card games. So I don't believe my review activities include any card games, but including card games is part of review activities. So I have 2 examples here. You can play war with flashcards. So the highest sum is the winner and they collect the cards. So there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. You can set goals as we've discussed. You can add those group contingencies like the good behavior game. You can provide those alternative materials. You can give choice. So you might select 5 problems that the students have to practice, the pairs have to practice, and the students can choose problems that they want to practice. And then interspersing or alternating practice. And so that you might choose to alternate between addition and subtraction, multiplication and division, basic facts, rather than basic and complex operations. Okay, so we are at our 1 hour mark. So thank you so much for hearing about why classroom intervention and the basics of what the classroom intervention is. So we're going to use a peer-assisted or peer-pair model, and we are going to follow those 9 steps that I just articulated. When you come back from your break, we will talk about in teams, how are we going to begin this process and what are we looking at? How does this work? So I don't know, Erica, do we want to give them till 9:45 to come back?
Yes, that sounds good. I will pause the recording. Everyone have a great break. We will see you back at 9:45.
There's a link, I believe. There's a link, I believe, in the chat to all of the materials that we're going to be talking about, including this PowerPoint. So as we move, I'm going to give you some orientation first before we move into breakout groups. But when you move into your breakout groups, you can think about, okay, who wants to pull up the PowerPoint and who wants to pull up the materials, and then you can organize your conversation that you want to have in that way. Okay, so let's get started on what this is going to look like for you. So the first thing to talk about is, what are the key computation areas to master? So when I talked about the background information, I said it's really good to have conversations about what are those critical skills that we need to have in order to facilitate algebra learning, right? And we talked about whole number proficiency being an important component. So we narrowed down to whole number proficiency. And then we need to figure out, okay, well, what are the key skills within that? And so there's a lot of different places where you can find skill scope and sequences that are more specific than what's offered through the Common Core system. You can do that through Brian Ponce. He has a website called mind.org. Amanda Vanderhayden has shared publicly a scope and sequence for her spring math program. Ed Shapiro in his book, Academic Skills Problems. And there is actually going to be a new version of this book, which I'm very excited about, which one of Ed Shapiro's graduate students did. And then you can look at things like Achieve the Core, which you may have heard about before. You can see on the bottom of this slide, I also have a link to intensiveintervention.org. And it says developing scope in sequence math courses. So that's another resource that you have. So there's lots of different resources to locate this information. I have done this for you, but I just wanted you to know that you can find this information lots of places. We certainly know that one of the ways to think about this in the grades 1 to 3 is starting with adding and subtracting. So fluently adding and subtracting within 5, then fluently adding and subtracting within 10, fluently adding and subtracting within 20, multiplying, of course, knowing from memory all products of two one-digit numbers, and then fluently multiplying and dividing within 100 using strategies that inform the relationship between multiplication and division, and then for all operations, solving for unknowns. Now, for the grades 1 to 3, I did not put any materials in for the solving for unknowns, but that's just something to look at and see where maybe that might fit in. It's possible to start doing that in 3rd grade, and it was something that I recommended in the 4th through 6th grade. So this is the backdrop for why I've sequenced things the way I have for each of your grades. And this is one of those conversations that you can have as a team. Do you like the way I sequence this? And if not, then please change it. Okay, so there are actually 9 weeks between next week and March 30th, if I calculated that correctly. So what I have done in each of your grade sample sequences, so you can see an example of grade 1 here, I'll show on the screen each grade level. I did 1 week of prep because in the prior sessions, that was some of the conversation that there wasn't enough prep time. And then here, I gave you some ideas for what to do for prep. So in terms of material prep, you're going to want to have counters. So you can use, of course, chips or dry beans or cereal. And by chips, I don't mean potato chips. I mean like poker chips. So anything really that you want to use as a counter, you probably already have some of those things in your classroom. I have provided number lines in case you don't have them, but my recommendation would be to laminate those number lines. Students can use dry eraser markers with them. There's a 0 to 5, a 0 to 10, and a 0 to 20 number line. I also have made 5 and 10 frames, which you also may want to laminate. You may want to laminate the fact triangle I provided for fact family practices, and you're going to want to locate flashcards, which I didn't anticipate previously as being as much of a challenge as it was. I think I do have like printed like Word document flashcards. If that's something that you'll need to have, I can definitely send that to you or have it uploaded to your link in Google. I have thinking cards that I provided to you, so you may want to edit them, but then you can also print those and laminate those. You can print the peer tutoring student cards, which reminds them what their job is when they work together. You can modify and print your goal reflection sheet, print and review and organize the review activities for the relevant operation that you're working on. And then, of course, print and organize the progress monitoring probes. So I provided all these materials for you, but there is some level of preparation and organization required. And so hopefully that will provide you with some good guidance on how to maybe do that to be ready to go for that first week. Each grade has a slightly different schedule. And I've given suggestions for extended weeks as well, if you want to follow that, or if you want to modify the schedule that I created for you and include those content in those extended weeks and sort of get rid of some of the content at the beginning. That's really up to you and your team. And you can see here as an example in week 2, you're going to focus on addition. You're going to do the pretest on Monday, day 1, and practice the peer tutoring structure and those thinking card strategies for addition. So that's the goal of that first day. The second day is going to be when you have the students really in their pairs. And I'm recommending that you start with sums to 5. You're going to use flashcards, and what I'm calling the error correction procedure, or the backup strategy, is to teach students to use the 5 frame or the number line. You can decide as a team if you want to have students flexibly use one or the other, or if you want students just to use one for the first week and then choose the other one for the second week. So that's really up to you. So you can see in the first 2 weeks here, we are doing addition sums to 5 as the focus. So you'll notice that on Friday, you have a progress monitoring day, and I provided those progress monitoring probes for you. So you'll also see that in the portal. And then the next week, you're continuing with that same skill, and then you're going to include review activities. And then you're going to progress monitor and do review activities on day 4, because I think you have that school day off. I'm not totally sure, but I tried to guess. So that's how I've tried to organize your schedule for you. So hopefully this is helpful. And then the subsequent week, so week 4, you're finishing out, or you're beginning, minuends to 5, and then you're using that for 2 weeks. Then you're going to sums to 10, etc. So that's grade 1. Grade 2 sample sequence. Again, I have that material preparation at the top. And then you'll note that we're starting with sums to 10, and then minuends to 10, sums to 20, etc. And it's a very similar structure and schedule. It's just different on the starting and ending point. I skipped past grade 3. And then grade 3, you can see that I started with review, sums to 5, sums to 10, sums to 20, minuends to 5 to 10 and to 20. And again, this is something that you're going to need to have a conversation about among your teams. If perhaps I'm overestimating where your students are at this point in time, then you may want to follow like the grade 2 sequence. So that's up to you. And then in week 4, I have you moving into fact family worksheets. The other thing I want you to I want you to have a conversation about what that schedule looks like for you and how that's going to work according to how I've organized it, if that makes sense for your students. This graph, or this slide, is showing you the checklist, which is a peer tutoring adherence checklist and protocol. You have a copy of that as well in your materials. And it's the steps that you are going to follow in order to make sure that this peer tutoring process is successful. These are the peer tutor protocols for flashcards and worksheets. So there are 2 separate ones, whether you're using a worksheet or a flashcard. I've also tried to make 2 versions, one for younger students and one for maybe that 3rd grade group that's slightly different. Again, this is going ahead and looking at those materials and seeing if you want to use them as is, or if you want to make some adjustments to them. It's also possible that I've made an error. So I believe I saw in one of my materials, I forgot the word you. So that's something to check as well. But this is an example of what the coach does, and there is visuals in here purposely to help students remember using those visuals and what the player does. And then again, we talked about those peer tutoring rules. So this is an example rule card that I developed for you. Again, you can keep this, you can use something else, you can adapt it to an already existing structure that you have for classroom management in your room. These are goal reflection ideas, and I listed this as ideas because you may choose to do this. You know your students best, so I think it's good to decide what makes sense for my students. How do I want to utilize this? Or do I not want to talk about the goal reflection ideas right now? I just want to help the students work well together. And then this part is not something that you include, and that is up to you. So you can make that choice. So these are 3 different examples of some goal reflection ideas. The first one is number of problems I will answer from memory today, number of problems I did answer from memory today. This is a coloring worksheet, addition facts I know. There's also one for subtraction. I do not think we have one for multiplication because we had developed this this middle sheet we developed for a math tier 2 program that we have been working on for a long time. I've been working on it with my colleague, John Begany from North Carolina State. And he has a helps reading fluency program. So we are building a math program. So that material we decided would be okay for me to share with you. So that's why there's copyright on some of these materials, because it's coming from our AMPS program. So this is one of those documents, but that might be something you want to use. And then there's one that's just a written document. What math skills are you confident with, should say? What math skills do you want to improve, and what can you do to improve your math skills? So again, thinking about the different grade levels in the different students that you have, what is it that you want to use in this space? Or maybe you decide you don't want to do some goal reflection initially. You just want to help the students be able to engage in that peer tutor process effectively and work together well. I did not provide flashcards, which is what you see here is not provided. And I already had mentioned that to you, but what you do have are the thinking strategies. You have some review activities like this bingo sheet you see here, and you have progress monitoring probes. So these probes all came from basic fact worksheets, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. So in your folders or in your portal, what you will have is a document called Classwide Math Intervention, grades 1 to 3 handouts. So that's this presentation that we're talking about. You will have a reporting template for grades 1 to 3, and that's what we're going to talk about at the end of today. It's what you're going to use to tell us how this worked for you on March 30th. So that's down the road. In the blue color here, you see Classwide Intervention Instructions, grades 1 to 3, and Classwide Intervention Materials, grade 1 to 3. In our first breakout, those are the 2 sets of materials that I would like you to access and start looking through. I'm going to give you some very specific directions in that, but those are the 2 documents that I want you to start looking through. There are review activities in these dark gray bars. So grades 1 to 3, there's addition and subtraction and multiplication and division review activities. Again, these are just ideas. So you may decide, hey, I like this one, I don't like this one. I have an idea for this one that you might want to share with your team members. So this is open. I've tried to give you some basics to begin with, but if you want to add to that, feel free to do so. And then the last 3 sections here are in green, and they are your progress monitoring probes. I believe there are 5 probes for each area. So like, in addition, there's sums to 5, and I think there are 5 probes in subtract, and then there's 5 sums to 5, 5 sums to 10, 5 sums to 20. And similarly with subtraction, and then there's multiplication and division probes. And then again, for those extensions, there's mixed addition and subtraction probes as well. That's when you're getting more into the fact family conversations. So Math Facts Cafe is where I made those probes from. So you can see there's actually, this is a great place to make those probes because this is, you're making low stakes decisions. It's okay that these don't have established reliability and validity. You're looking at growth over time. There are randomizers on the backside of these worksheet generators. So they randomize the problems within the parameters that you give. This is one of the better sites to go to because you can make those parameters what you would like them to be, which is good. You have a number of different options. There are also some generators like this on Intervention Central, although I do think Intervention Central actually now links to Math Facts Cafe. You can also find pre-established materials on mind.org, and this is what that website looks like when you open it up. Okay. For the breakout, I would like you to, as I mentioned earlier, look at those 2 sets of documents that I believe were in blue on the previous slide. So that's going to be the Classwide Intervention Instructions and the Classwide Intervention Materials PDF files. I want you to first review the schedule. Is there anything that you want to change? Do you like the sequence that I provided? Is the sequence too easy? Is the sequence too hard? You can start to look at the other grade levels to see how you might want to rearrange your schedule if you decide you want to do so. Then I'd like you to think about what do you want your rules of engagement to be, or the rules that students will follow during that peer tutoring process. Do you like the ones I provided? Do you want to make some edits? Do you have ones you already use in your classroom that you would prefer? And then do you want to use a goal reflection activity? What will that activity be of the 3 I gave you? Or do you have a different activity you would like to try? Or would you like to hold off and not use that right away and wait and see? So what the plan will be is to give you 30 minutes to work through those documents and those 3 questions. And then we'll come back together and have a large group discussion where I can answer questions that you might have generated in your group that would be good for everybody to hear so that we can make sure that we're clarifying and understanding how we want to do things. Or you might even just want to share, hey, this is what we were thinking. Does this sound like a good plan? So with that, I'm going to back up my slide, and this is the time that you can enter into your breakout group. So I will let Lauren and Erica kind of guide you on that. Thank you. Okay, so before we move on to the next prep part and then the next breakout room, I wanted to have the opportunity for the teams to share out some of their conversations or questions that they had that would be good for the whole group to consider, or even, you know, what did you guys decide that you wanted to adopt or change? So I think anyone can begin.
Hi, Robin. We just kind of decided or discussed the fact that the scope and sequence of when it is, being that this is January, a lot of the teachers have already gone past the skills that are in week 1, 2, 3. I think Linda from our group said that they would probably start on like, I don't remember what she said, like 8 or 9 or something like that.
Yep.
So how could we possibly adjust that to where we are with the materials that are already, you know, given?
Yep. So one of the things that you want to ensure is that students are actually fluent and not just accurate. What grade levels are you guys, was it all 1 to 3, or was it a specific grade level?
That was just mentioned like in the 2nd grade level, but
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that maybe in the 1st and 3rd grade level would probably be similar.
Yeah, so I built this because I started in the 4th to 6th grade level, and they had me back way down into the 3rd grade one. So what I would recommend is that you, if that's where you're feeling like, then you can pre-test in the point in which you think that your students are with that probe, and then see what their fluency level is. Because I'm suspecting that students might be accurate but not fluent, and the goal here is to build that fluency. We're going to talk in a little bit about what we want that rate to be. But if you're in 2nd grade and feeling like that, then you can use the 3rd grade sequence. And if you're in the 3rd grade sequence, then I can add the 4th grade sequence. So like the 1st grade teachers could use the 2nd grade sequence, the 2nd grade teachers could use the 3rd grade sequence, and then I can send the 4th grade sequence and load up those materials afterwards. So I can talk with the patent team about how to do that.
That was actually like the second part of our question. We do have a few people that are working with like older. We have a 4th grade group, but they're lower. So I think that they would be okay on those levels. But we also have our title, our 4th and our 4th through 6th or 5th and 6th grade title person for math on here that we would actually like to gain the 4th through 6th grade materials if possible. We tried to attend that training in the beginning, but there was a miscommunication where we didn't get to attend. So hopefully we could probably do that, you know, for that grade level as well.
Yeah, so there's a whole portal with those level materials. So then you can just pull, if you can get access to that, then you can just pull whatever you need from there over. And then, like I said, I did on those sequences, there should be some extensions where you could begin going down those extensions, and then those extensions should wrap into that 4th grade content. Other conversations.
Another concern with ours with the coach and player aspect was that some of our intervention groups are so low that we probably wouldn't have enough coaches to be able to get that specific program to run as we had hoped. I think that we would have more players just because of their low level ability.
So that's okay, because everyone is a coach and everyone is a player. So then what you would just consider is that everybody's at the same level. So in that circumstance, you want to just think about them as being equivalent, and that's fine too. So the key point there is how you set that up and where you start them and how you help them support each other in that process. So that would be okay.
We also had a question about the coach and player. For the flashcard activities, it was pretty clear, you know, what the coach was doing, what the player was doing. But in the worksheet activities, we weren't super clear on what the coach was doing.
So there should be another, and I may have forgotten to put that in, but there should be a separate sheet for coach and player for worksheets. And it talks about exactly what the step is for the worksheet. So with a worksheet, the students are going together over one problem, for example, and then they're having the students answer that problem, and then they're doing those error corrections in that way. But those steps are separate, and they should be a document in there that has a separate coach and player card for worksheets.
No, it did. So only the players doing the worksheet. And
Only players doing the worksheet, but so you would envision it like the two coach and the player are working over the same worksheet together, and the coach is explaining the problem and the player is solving the problem, and then they move to the next one, and then they switch roles.
Okay. And we also had a question arise around this with differentiation. If you're talking about math facts, your kiddos are going to be in different places. You know, for first grade, some of your students might be well past, facts to 5. So what would be appropriate when you think about grouping? Would it be appropriate to have pairs, of similar abilities so they can work on the same facts? Would it be appropriate to have each student with their own flashcards and different sets of flashcards? Is this not a place to differentiate?
Yeah, so you could differentiate. This generally is a place where we don't differentiate, and that's where you start at the lowest level to catch all the students. And then you also just build that confidence in so you're building different skills in the higher performing students who are helping coach the lower performing students, because you're helping them to understand, like, what do they know? What do they not know? How do they help students? How do they build that social skill? And they also build a lot more confidence. And so then you're gradually moving up. So this is where you're trying to target the most students, so the skill gaps that most students have. So if you're finding, so I talk about this next or in a little bit. And so if you do a pretest and you're finding, so the pretest is based on fluency and accuracy, it's a rate-based measure. And so if you're finding that your students are in the 40 to 50 digit correct per minute range, then you would move up the skill level. So you can make a really database decision here. So you can start with what you think is the appropriate place to begin, and then see what the data tell you. And then you can go down and up accordingly. So you can go down the sequence if they're actually on average, the class average is not hitting that, and then you can go up. So I would say, Christine, on the differentiation, you can do that, but hold off and try it in this first. Let's catch everybody in where the majority of skill gap is. So see where the average scores are on some of these. So you might even decide to have a couple of pre-tests. So you might say, all right, I'm going to do pre-test. So I'm going to just take the first grade sequence that I can remember easier off the top of my head. So you might say, okay, we're going to start with sums to 20 and see where we are there. So when you do the sums to 20, if students are in that 40 to 50, then you know that you're going to move into subtraction. Usually in subtraction, I will say in the second and third grade, that is where we see most of the gaps, is that students do not have any fluency with subtraction whatsoever. And then you could work on the mixed facts piece as well. So one of the things I did not include, and I think this is in the 4th through 6th grade content, is also the non-traditional facts that I was presenting to you. So if you're wanting to have some increased challenge, that's another avenue to go down. But you can also just make this as a database decision. So you might say, okay, I'm going to try sums to 20. I'm going to set minuends to 20 and see where it looks from there. If everybody's below 40, then actually students are not fluent in that skill. And then you're going to say, okay, we'll do sums to 10, minuends to 10. Where are they there? And so you can proceed up and down accordingly. If that makes sense. I know the 4th grade said that students were not fluent on average, in multiplication for sure, but they couldn't even start with multiplication because they had issues with the sums to 20 and minuends to 20. So you just want to make sure that that's not the case for your group. And so I think the best way to do it is just to maybe expand how many pretests you give in that first week and see, okay, where are my students? And then how do I set that sequence from there?
Dr. Cotting, where are we finding the pretest materials? Are they part of the progress monitoring file?
Yes, so they're part of the progress monitoring. So I can also, we can either add them or you can make your own. So there's 5 per each subcategory of each operation. So I tried to build in opportunities for you to use more pre-tests or more post-tests, but I can also always send more if you're end up saying, okay, I need to actually pre-test multiple skills to identify the target skill area. And so I can just add those to you. But they are in the progress monitoring materials that are broken out by, I believe, operation. Other questions?
I'm sorry, I have a question. Is there any way that we could get those links sent to our email? Or is that not a possibility?
That's an Erica question, I think.
Do you want to send me, can you private message me your email, Amy, and I can do that?
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So does that make sense on how to sequence and how to organize your sessions? And then definitely one adaptation would be to differentiate, but I would suggest, as I mentioned earlier, start with everybody gets the same thing and does the same process together, and then see if you feel like you really need to differentiate.
One question that we had was, does every student need their own set of flashcards, or is it one set per team?
One set per team. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Anything else before we move to the next set of materials?
Dr. Cotting, you had said that if kids have accuracy, we should look to use the assessment information for fluency. And I believe you said if they have 40 to 50 digits correct, that might be an indicator that they could move past that skill to perhaps the next skill set. If we're giving kids different progress monitoring tools and using that as our pretest to identify where we want to intervene and what skill set we want to target, I imagine we'd use the first few progress monitoring measures as our pretest. If we see kids in the 40 to 50 range, we know what to do. What's the range where it would confirm that we want to stay on that skill set, or what's a score range that might indicate we might want to go back to a prior more foundational skill?
George, this question makes me so happy. Thank you for asking that question. So I do think I have this data in the slides, and I can always amend these slides because it's later down in the slides to answer that. But yes, so the target, so 40 to 50 is your target for mastery. And so then we're aiming for 20 to 39 for instructional. So if it's below 20, we're talking about frustration level.
I think that made me think of another question. I didn't read all the progress monitoring probes, but we're doing digits correct per minute. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so not, I know that a lot of the regular ed teachers, not sure exactly if it's like this everywhere, but we're used to grading for entire problem instead of, going across. I mean, I've used Ames Web, things where you do digits correct per minute, but maybe that would be something that would be helpful to like explain a little bit, or if, I don't know, like I said, if it's in the materials or.
Yeah, definitely. I have a really brief primer on that, but we could always upload a more specific instructional guideline for that. Didn't know if I heard another question.
It might have been an accidental unmute there.
That sounds fine. And then did people decide to do a goal reflection, no goal reflection? Where did you kind of land on that? Or did you want to just figure out the process first?
Hey, Robin, hi.
Yeah.
Yeah, our group did talk about the goal reflection in reference to our relationship to the students self-charting their progress. Being that's a nice discussion point that we could have with a kid, like what helped you to do so well, or I know you bombed today basically, but look, you had a streak going, so it was just an off day. We also talked about, so not to single students out, to have a class-wide goal. If we had in total 78 correct last week, let's try for 82 this week. But again, referring back to validating progress or supporting, when you kind of miss a day.
I love that. I think that's wonderful in both ways that you described it, and helping students individualize it to themselves. And then how is a classroom, what is our goal? Our goal is to master these skills and move on to the next thing. Look at what our class did. So you can build in that component as well. And I love how the way you were talking about is really helping students understand, hey, sometimes there are bumps in the road, and that's fine because we learn from those bumps, but look at how well we're doing and what we're learning along the way. I think that's great.
Dr. Cotting, there was one comment in the chat, and I had a couple questions about that. Is there a variation in the digits correct per minute based on grade level? I know the Iris Center put out 20 digits correct in first grade, 40 in third grade. So can you confirm or maybe discuss?
Yeah, there is, and so I can modify and send that to you. But here, so in the book that I wrote, I use all of the criteria and I make a big table. I did not provide that. I could provide that to you. And there's variation in the empirical data. And so what I was aiming for is that higher level. If you actually look at, oh my gosh, I'm blanking right now on the precision teaching. If you look at precision teaching, it's much higher than anything we do when they talk about proficiency in the precision teaching world. So I am aiming at that 40 to 50 as being like a higher benchmark, but I can absolutely provide that chart that gives all of them, all the empirical evidence. And I have not seen the Iris Center chart, so I'll have to take a look at what the Iris Center chart says and where they're getting their data from. But we can do 20 is really low, I will say. And so I think that's not a great indicator, even for the littles. I think it's good to hit that 40, but again, there is a little bit of an art here because there isn't consistent evidence. But I was giving you guys the higher level of proficiency in our tools. So it's fine if you decide that you want to aim for a different level of proficiency. Lauren, if you don't mind putting that link in the chat, and then I'll take a look at it during the next breakout, and then see if I can find a slide of, or give you a shot of my chart that I have. That's a great question though.
Dr. Cotting, I hope you don't mind me asking one more question here. So you had mentioned with the progress monitoring tools that they're organized by skill. So in our Hanover team, we have a lot of interventionists. They have a lot of mixed ability groups. They have kids with, very discrepant skill sets. And so I feel like gathering that pretest data is really a good initial step. Would you recommend, if a teacher or an interventionist, a tier 1 teacher, is providing instruction and they believe kids have a skill set around, subtraction or whatnot, would you recommend using the progress monitoring tool for subtraction? Or if they suspect that there may be a range of skills, would you recommend they use the assessment that targets multiple different skills, where it mixes addition, subtraction, etc., and then they're scoring not just for that accuracy, but that fluency to see about their point of intervention?
Yeah, I mean, that's another way that you can absolutely make that adjustment. Often the mixed skills involves not just understanding addition and subtraction, but being able to track it too. So you get some other challenges that come into play when you use those mixed probes. It's why I kind of put it at the end, because once students are proficient in either of the other two areas, then they start to think about the relationship between the two and start to make those connections. But you can definitely target the mixed probe as the outcome measure if you would prefer. And then you would be looking at one outcome measure over time, as over a longer period of time, as opposed to changing the progress monitoring, every week or every 2 weeks. Right.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's move into the next section and we'll have another opportunity to have large group conversation after that as well. Okay, so this time I want you to talk about the Classwide intervention materials document, the one that you started looking through, as well as the review activities. Go back to how things are organized, have more opportunity to think out how you want to modify some of the review activities. Which ones do you like? What ones maybe do you have review activities you want to add? And then this would give you another opportunity to look at the schedules across different grades and see how do you want to rearrange those schedules. And then, of course, you can look at those progress monitoring tools too. So one of the things I did not do, I was realizing as I had put all of them in one big packet, is you can see by looking at the answers where the break is between like sums to 5 and sums to 10. But I didn't give a placeholder to tell you, okay, this set is for sums to 5, this set is for sums to 10. So think about how, if you look at your schedule more strategically, what does it say to use? What are the materials that are provided? Are those the things you want to use? Do you want to, again, borrow from another grade level? So again, some more targeted opportunities to think about how you want to organize the content and materials, and this time adding in those review activities and thinking about that progress monitoring piece. Okay.
So breakout rooms are ready. Was that 30 minutes again? I'm sorry.
Yes, we can do 20 maybe this time.
20. Okay,
Yeah.
sure. Let me just fix that very quickly. 20 minutes. Okay. Everyone will be able to choose their own room, and I added just in case we almost have everybody back here.
Okay.
And here they come. You're good to go.
All right. So the next part of what we're going to talk about is more about how to use our data to inform what we're doing. And then, of course, talking about the reporting out. Before we do that, I just want to go back. I was reflecting on a couple things that I can do to assist you once you've identified what you think your needs are and whether or not we have the content for those needs to be met. First of all, I can definitely work with Patents to give you access to the grades 4 to 6 content. And then I can also rebuild some of the sequences if I can get some specific guidance. You can email me directly for different teams and I can provide that to you. I did that last time, and then we put all of those additional sort of sequences or materials in the portal. So feel free to email me separately and then I can make those adjustments for you if that's helpful to you. The other thing I want you to remember, and when we're talking about classroom intervention, is that we are trying to identify, if we look at our classroom as a group, and it's much easier to do with those series of pre-tests. Was it George? Did I remember your name right? He was talking about using the different pre-tests in a sequence to see where their students are. That's literally what I do to identify what the skill is. If I was going to come into your setting and do it with you, is I would identify a couple of different types of pretests that I thought, based on the conversations that you had, or maybe your universal screening data, where we would maybe want to target your classroom, and I would give those to your classroom students, and then I would identify what the median score is for digits correct per minute. And I would use that to determine my starting point, because it's important to know that we are targeting all of the students and identifying what most of that student skill gap are. There are going to be students that are below the average, and we already know that, but it will still help them and benefit them to participate in the classroom process. So it's really important not to remove students from the class-wide intervention. It's addressing the gaps that the class as a whole has. And then, from there, if we see that those students aren't improving, which they will, but they're not improving at the same level as the other students in your classroom, then we can know what we're going to do with them going forward, or how we could amend their probably already existing individualized or targeted supports. So it's important to make sure that everybody in your classroom is participating, and we're going to strive to target the middle, and everybody does benefit. And I know it's hard to imagine this because you haven't probably done it before, but the literature is very clear that the higher performing students and the lower performing students benefit equally from a peer tutoring process that targets the median skill need of the class. So everyone does benefit. So I just wanted to put that reminder in for you. Okay, with that, I think we have some decisions that we should make as a group going forward in terms of the criteria that we want to use. So let's, well, I guess before we do that, let me pause and say, are there any other questions that popped up that we can talk through before I do this other data piece with you?
We had a question about the universal screener used, we mention it, but do you have something that you use other than just the plain old probes, like grade level wise, that you could suggest for us to use? Because we really don't have an actual screener. I mean, we have things that we use, but I don't think that they're actually considered screeners.
Yeah, so you can tell me what they are and I can let you know what I think of them, but we could do that offline too. So I think the free ones that are available that are easy access to download would be Acadians. There are probes. Easy CBM does have probes, and that's up to your own individual school. My difficulty with the Easy CBM probes is that I think they lump a lot of strands together that doesn't make decision making helpful. So I prefer the Acadians probes, but those are the two free screeners that are available.
We recently purchased Acadians, well, in the beginning of the school year, but it still hasn't, really surfaced yet, but it definitely is in the works. And some of our fourth, fifth, and sixth grade title people are using those Acadians probes that I found for free as some progress monitoring. So that's good to hear that that's a good suggested one. Just hopefully we can get it soon.
Yeah, and that's fine. The way we're doing it as an intervention process, it would be at the class-wide level is very similar to what you would do at the individual or targeted group level, because we want to actually drill down and see where are those skill gaps. And then we want to monitor progress in those skills. But like was pointed out in the last session, you can also use those mixed skill probes if you wanted to target a longer term skill outcome, and then just keep that progress monitoring probe consistent. Other thoughts?
I have a question. You may have already answered it and I just didn't understand. So I want to figure out, I'm a third grade teacher, where the bulk of my students have the biggest gap, correct?
Yeah. You have it. That's exactly it.
So how do I know how many students to know? Like I have 20 students now, because I just lost one. How do I know about how many of those students, if they're struggling, that's where I should start?
Okay. So that's coming next. So I will show you, can I hold off and then you ask your question again if I don't answer it in the next slides?
Yes. Thank you.
Other questions that popped up?
Dr. Cotting, we had a question from our group looking through the materials. We weren't sure of what the procedures were for implementing the fact family practice in grade 2. So we looked through those and we just weren't sure what those procedures were.
Okay, so with the fact family practice, that's in the standard materials, that's with the triangle, right? And the directions underneath below that. So did I not provide directions? So the intent there is, so they are underneath are the boxes with all of the facts, right? So you would just give a fact family. So you would just give the 3 numbers and have the Again, or the coach can give the 3 numbers, or you can put the 3 numbers on the top, and they can go through as many of those problems. And then the player is supposed to fill out that triangle, put the numbers in each of the triangle, right? Or the coach can put the number in each triangle, and the player is going to make the equations. And then the coach can give feedback. And then when they switch, they would do different problems. Okay. And none of these materials are like set in stone. I just wanted to give you things to start with. So as you begin to do this, you might say, hey, I have this other activity that's really similar that I like better. And you can use that as your peer tutor activity. These are just examples of ideas for what you can do. Other questions before we move ahead? Okay, so let's talk about using your data, because that's, I think, where a lot of the questions are coming from, because it sounds like, and I love that this is the way that it sounds like most of the teams are leaning, they would like to do maybe a more expansive pre-test and figure out exactly where their students are falling. So I think that's fantastic. So we had talked earlier, what we are using with progress monitoring is something called the sub-skill mastery approach. And that means that we're drilling down on not the larger skill, but the sub-skills to make sure that students have the sub-skills. And when we do that, it means that we often need to change that target every week. So that's how you see the skill building happening. So one way to modify your sequence is, I think I gave you 2 weeks of many of the skills. You can make that 1 week. That's a way to modify, and then you can move through those skills faster. The idea that I had generated for our particular work in this trial is to do a pre-test and a post-test based on these rate-based materials, which are curriculum-based measures. So you would do every Monday, you're going to do the pre-test. Every Friday, you're going to do the post-test or the progress monitoring. And then I had built it just partly based on the feedback from the prior older grades that had worked on this, that they actually had wanted another opportunity to monitor progress in the same skill before moving on. So then again, Monday, you would have another pre-test. It might be in the same skill area, but you're just, again, getting more data points, and then another post-test the next Friday. So that's how the sequence was originally arranged. You can make the modifications that we've already talked about, which include having those mixed skill probes as being always your progress monitoring tool, and using that for a longer period of time. So instead of having sums to 5 and minuends to 5, you might have a mixed addition subtraction where the facts are to 5, or the I guess the highest numeral that would be utilized would be 5. I'm going to talk about the digits correct per minute, because I think that's where we need to make a decision. And I think we just decide as a group about what we think we want to do. We'd already talked about if the median pretest score on, for example, that first, let's say we're following the sequence the way it is lined up, is high, then you would move to the next topic. If it's lower than what we would want, not in that target range, the instructional range is what we refer to it, then you would want to go down. So let's talk about how we make that decision. Okay, so this is the IRIS guide that was generated. So some of this IRIS guide makes sense to me, I will be honest with you, and some of it does not, based on my knowledge of the empirical data. So this is an option. The 5th and 6th grade data do not make sense to me. So unless I understand better where these numbers came from, they're very different than what the empirical data says. But the 1st through 3rd grade, well, the 1st through 2nd grade data are consistent with the literature. But let me show you the 3 major sources of data, which is in the table that I have on the next slide. And then we as a group can decide how we want to do it. And then we'll just decide. And then I can make that adjustment to the slides. And then we can upload the revised version. I'll say revised, slides. So then here is the next one. So this was what the question was that was asked earlier. How do we know if it's how do we know if it was the just right skill, if it's a skill that's going to be too hard, or if it's a skill that's going to be too easy. So you can see we have 3 sets of criteria. Dino and Merkin, which is pretty low when you consider it compared to the other 2 sources. So Dino and Merkin says if you're in grades 1 to 3, frustration is fewer than 10 digits correct per minute. Instructional, which is the just right skill, that's the skill you want to be targeting, is 10 to 19 digits correct per minute, and the mastery is 20 or more digits correct per minute. My concern about this is that the other 2 sources are higher than that, but we can, we can decide to make that, we can make this decision however you want to. The Howl is the highest level criterion in some ways because it essentially says, look, if you're less than 20 digits correct per minute, you're in the frustration range regardless of grade level. 20 to 30 is that just right range. And then 40 or higher is the mastery range. Burns, Vanderheyden, and Gibbon is one of the few empirical studies that existed. So these were all quasi-experimental studies that informed the Dino and Merkin and the Howell, Fox and Moorhead, and Burns, Vanderheyden, and Gibbon was more empirical and more updated. So they have for grades 2 to 3, they did not include first grade in their sample. It was less than 14 digits correct per minute is in the frustration range. So that's the too hard skill. So you would want to go down to the previous skill if that was what your class demonstrated. The just right is 14 to 31 digits correct per minute. And the too easy, right, because they've mastered it, is 32 or more digits correct per minute. So I'm going to pause there and have us have a conversation about what do we want to do? What do we want our target to be? Do we want it to be the Dino and Merkin, the Howell, which is what your criterion actually is, or do we want it, and that should be like 20 to 39. I think Jared pointed that out to me at one point in time, because obviously you lose 10 points if it's not 20 to 39. And then do you want it to be the Burns criteria? So let's just decide as a group what we think makes the most sense to us. And then we're going to go with that. And I'll adjust this larger PowerPoint. I don't know if there's anything in the chat. I didn't look at the chat.
There is nothing yet in the chat.
Okay.
But anyone, please feel free to comment.
There was a request in the chat to share this slide, this table, and I looked at the PowerPoint in the Google folder, and it's not included in the original PowerPoint, just to let you know.
Yes, I just added this because of our
hey,
prior
thanks.
conversation. So what I will do, George, is send this right afterwards to Pat and they'll upload it for you. And it will
Thanks so
say
much.
revised on it in capital letters, so everybody knows.
Thanks.
Another potential option, if no one has any sort of general thoughts on this, is that I can just, again, provide these slides to you, and then you can tell us on the sharing out timeline what criteria you employ. That's another option, but you want to make sure that you decide on what your criteria is and you stick with it and that you don't move it. Does that make sense? So you can't switch like, oh, I'm going to apply Dino and Merkin, and then halfway through say, nope, I'm going to use Burns and Vanderheyden. You have to pick one set of criteria to employ. So if we don't have like a group consensus, I think that's okay, but you need to have consensus in your own units on what that criteria will be for you.
There is a comment in the chat. I'm not quite sure what they're asking. It says how many questions are in the question set regarding Burns. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so that doesn't, just because this is a time-based, all probes are basically created equal. We have some guidelines on those probes from Mark Shin and colleagues, and they all range from 35 to 60 problems. You don't want students to be finishing the the problems on the skill set in the timeline. You want there to be more than possible because it's a time-based measure. It's a rate-based measure, so you don't have to worry about that.
Are you seeing the comment in the chat about a cadence, Dr. Cotting?
Yep, so each individual, that's a good question. So the question is, with those of us using a cadence, it's around 11 for benchmark for first and second grade and about 14 for third grade midway through the year if we want to align. So remember that these are sub-skill mastery measures, and these are the generic criteria created for the generic probes that I've given you. The Acadians tools are going to be different, and they're going to be norm based on the Acadians tools. So if you're going to use sub-skill, and most of the Acadians measures are not what I would call sub-skill mastery measures, they're grade level measures. And so grade level measure criteria are going to be different than these sub-skill mastery measures, which are really focusing on targeted skills. So, but that is also a way to think about it. So you could say, so we would expect, so I guess what I'm saying is, if you have more grade level skills and a probe, we're going to expect lower, right, digits correct per minute. And we know, we just actually published this really long synthesis of curriculum-based measures. We know that those general outcome measures that are, we can also talk about as grade level content measures, display less growth over time because there's more skills on them. So it takes a lot longer, right, for students to show growth on them. These are sub-skill mastery measures, and we're going to see more growth faster on these. So that's the difference between the two tools that you're talking about. Two types of forms of tools, I guess I would say. So 22nd for third. So that, I mean, that kind of lines up with the Dino and Merkin. So what the discussion from Karen in the chat is that if you think about the Acadians norms for the Acadians probes, they line more up with Dino and Merkin's criteria. So again, why don't we do this? We'll just make a decision that your unit is going to make a determination about whether you're employing Dino and Merkin, Howell and Fox, or Burns and colleagues. Okay. You have to keep that same criteria with for your decision-making practices the entire time. Okay. And you're going to tell us what criterion you went with and why when you do your share outs. Does that sound like a good plan to everybody that everyone's comfortable with? Everyone's like, I'm not comfortable with this level of flexibility on this.
I see some
Can I
not.
ask a question quick?
Yes.
So is this with our school unit, do we have to pick the same one, or can each of us pick our own but stick with it the whole time?
I don't know if anyone in Patton has a recommendation on that, because I just don't know how your units are constructed. So I feel like I don't have context to know how to advise you in this.
Like, I would like to do the Burns Vander Heyden, but it doesn't have first grade like there. So, and we have at least 2 first grade teachers on our team.
So I think it's okay to use that same criteria for first grade.
So they could, it's like first through third grade for the Burns?
Yep. I think that would be fine.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and do you see now how to use the criteria to make the determination for your grade level? Because that was your question before. So your question was, okay, let's say I give sums to 20. And on average, my class, well, I'll give this example to you guys and you can tell me. We're going to do sums to 20. My class median score in terms of digits correct per minute is 12. Is that skill appropriate for the class-wide intervention? I see people shaking their head. So no. Why? Someone said it is no, but why? Anyone want to tell me?
12 would be in the frustration level, correct?
Yep, 12 is in the frustration level. So because this is a fluency building activity that we're doing with students, right? We want to target the just right level. The caveat is, of course, if you're in first grade and you're saying, well, every skill is frustrational, then you start with the lowest skill in the sequence, right? And you have enough backup strategies that you're going to support students with. So you want to try to make that initial skill level that you target that just right skill. And there could be more than one of those just right skills. So you might say to me, well, Robin, if there's more than one of those just right skills, what do I target? And my recommendation to you would actually be to start with the earlier skill in the sequence and make sure students are really confident and have that really well, and then move up to the next one. Is everyone feeling comfortable about moving forward? You can also email me once you do your pre-tests and say, Robin, this is what our data is. What do you think? I am happy. I actually get very excited about this stuff. So you can definitely send it to me and I'll be like, oh, this is what I think.
Robin, I did put your email in the chat for people, and then from Patton's purview, we just want to make sure people have what they need to make decisions as teams and then move forward with implementation and be able to share their outcomes. So it's really a team-based decision, I think, as you kind of mentioned. Thank you.
Okay. So you will have these updated slides. Your target will be identified by your team or your unit. I also am going to ask you to collect data on accuracy, the percentage of problems that were attempted that are answered correctly. You don't want to, because there will be more problems on these probes than students can possibly answer in the timeline. You don't want to, you only want to score them on the things that they attempted. So that's what that caveat is there. And then previously, folks had asked about how do we train people on how to score digits correct per minute. And so these two slides are helpful here. You can also find this guide on interventioncentral.org. So it tells you about how to, you're just counting the digits on the bottom underneath the answer line. And each of the probes should have an answer key, so you know how many digits there are in each line of the probe. Reversed or rotated digits are not counted as errors unless, you know, a change in position makes them appear like another digit. Individual correct digits are counted as correct. Individual digits that are incorrect are counted as errors. And we won't have too much with place value because we have a lot of basic skills that we're working on. But if you are moving up in your sequence to those more complex computation skills, then you do want to consider place value, which the example for that is on the right-hand side of your screen. So if there are questions on this scoring guide, which is pretty simple, it's pretty easy to do. And then you just count up all the correct digits and you divide it by the correct plus incorrect digits or the total number attempted. And that's how you get your score. But if there are questions on that, you can also email me as well or consult this particular guideline. The progress monitoring, so on your reporting out sheet, you'll see something like this or this exact sheet where it says whatever your outcome measure is, you're going to report out the median digits correct and the median percent problems completed correctly. And I put here a pre-test, a post-test 1, and a post-test 2 for, I think, every skill. So obviously you would change this table to match what you decide to do as a team and how many data points you end up having for a particular skill or skills area. All right, so our wrapping up activities here are, you're going to describe out at the next session your activities, you're going to report your data, you're going to talk about what went well and what barriers came up. And then what solutions did you apply to those barriers? So going back to those adaptations that you can make that we talked about earlier, thinking about the data sequence that you started on or considering other possibilities like adding goal reflection. So going back to those slides when you have barriers to think about what would be the solutions to those barriers and how did you make those decisions. And that reporting out template is in your portal already.